So I'm really honored to be here tonight to moderate the discussion. Now I'm sure you all have a lot of questions, so I'm going to be very brief in this and really rely on you to direct the questions at our guests here tonight. I can't imagine who would have a deeper perspective of this time in our country, of what happened at the University of Alabama, and where you sit now. Can you kind of introduce yourself to everyone, based on you coming from the family that you did, the kind of conversations, decisions that led to your sister having the strength of character to actually endure something like that?
Sure, thank you, Keith. I'm Sharon Malone, and I'm Vivian's youngest sister, for those of you who don't know. But I would also like to introduce family members, because we have my oldest brother, Elvin Malone, who is here, my sister, Margie Malone Tuxon, who is also here, and most importantly, we have Vivian's children, Monica Jones and Michael Jones. So thank you for being here. Now, I'm going to give you the short version of that, because anything that I have wrong, my brother will correct, because he actually remembers it. I have the story as told to. But my parents were pretty remarkable people, and I have to tell you that, and for those of you, and there are many people in the room who actually knew Vivian, and you know the woman that she was, and amazingly, she was that woman when she was 20 years old. As a parent now, and I have a daughter who's 21 years old, and one of the things that really, the more I've seen of this, the more I've studied it, I'm just amazed. Because, I knew Vivian as my sister. I didn't know Vivian as this icon, and how important what she was, what she did at that time. But more importantly, I look at my parents, and I look at the technology that was going on here. You couldn't exactly keep in, close contact. But when Vivian and James sort of got to the end of this process, my parents had to let her go. And you notice in none of the footage, my parents weren't there. My parents were in Mobile. And if you can imagine how difficult it was for the Attorney General to know what was going on, my parents had no idea. They had to trust that the United States government and the lawyers of the Justice Department were going to take care of their daughter. And they let her go. And for that entire week, as they were preparing for the confrontation, Vivian and James were really taken away to an undisclosed location. They were in Birmingham practicing and preparing for this. And my parents didn't know where she was. And they did not, she would check in from time to time, but they didn't want my parents to come because they couldn't protect all of them. They wanted a small number. Vivian and James could not stay. The hotels were segregated at that time, and shortly before this confrontation, even if they had been allowed to stay in the Gaston Motel, which was the segregated hotel in Birmingham, the hotel had been bombed less than a month before. I think actually 2 weeks before this confrontation. So this is sort of the cauldron that they were thrown into. And, to say that they were brave and to say that my parents were, I guess you had to have nothing but faith that it was going to work out.
Yeah. Attorney Siegel, you were also very intimately involved on this part of history. I mean, it's really, current history in some ways. Can you tell us, you were a student then, and you were also an officer, of the student body. Can you tell us, what was it like, for you and the role that you had to play, with other students and assuring, that this, could happen on your campus?
Well, there were a lot of strong feelings at that time, and doing a big thing that I wanted to see, and that a lot of students did, was that we did not have the problem at the University of Alabama that Ole Miss had had just 8 months earlier. Many of you may recall that 8 months earlier, when James Meredith began to integrate Ole Miss, there were riots, there were deaths, there were attacks on the National Guard, and it was just a terrible scene. And so we began to try and make sure that wouldn't happen at the University of Alabama. And as a result, several of the student government officers spent the 3 or 4 months before Vivian and James came on campus getting ready. Some very brave students at Alabama took Vivian and James out to Stillman College, where various students of Alabama met them so they would have some friends on campus or some friendly faces when they saw what was going on. We spoke to all fraternities, sororities, and dormitories about the necessity of peaceful integration and what rioting could do to tear up the University of Alabama. And so that's sort of what we took as our goal, was to see that it went peacefully. And when you watched John Kennedy give his speech, one of the things that did not make the cut was about his second sentence of his second paragraph. He said, part of the fact that the integration went smoothly was because of the students at the University of Alabama who stood tall and shared their responsibilities the way they should. So,
Yeah. One question that your son-in-law actually asked, was it because the students felt it was something that was right and moral, or was it to avoid conflict and violence?
you know, for each student on campus, I guess there may be a different answer to that, but primarily what I noticed was most of the students were not in favor of integration. They were in favor of peaceful occurrence of integration. They recognized it was being inevitable, and more as they saw what was going on, they became more progressive. And I think that's what we met mainly was to have peaceful integration, not that these people were in favor of it. As that began to change, when next year the student legislature, the student government legislature, passed a resolution opposing Wallace's bid to have a third term, and likewise, I had sort of been the face of integration on campus, and I ran for president of the student government and won. So it must have been a change in the attitudes of students at that time.
Dr. Malone, did your family and your parents, they believe and instill the notion of integration, or was it really to, get the best life education for yourselves? What was the thinking that went on?
I actually, and this is something that, it has been a hard question because, the white people that we grew up were so vehemently opposed to integration. And I think that the impetus behind the black people wasn't because they were just so dying to be in the company of white people, because I don't think that was what it was all about. It was just that they felt as if that the rights that they should have had and had been denied for generations, it was time, they wanted those rights. And you know what, and our family, our parents came to Mobile from the Black Belt region in Alabama. They were raised on farms. Our family had been in Alabama for 6 generations by the time they got to us. And I think that, if anyone deserved the rights and privileges of being an Alabamian, and that's going to a state school, I think that's how they felt. They felt that they only wanted the rights that were due them as citizens of the state of Alabama and of the United States. So integration per se was just the route by which one had to get to that.
When you watch your sister, in this archival footage, we see her. I mean, she's just so stoic and poised and in control. Is there something else going on that we're not seeing that you can give us insight to?
Vivian at that point was 20 years old.
And it's remarkable, a
And-
20-year-old could
And
handle herself like that.
I have a 21-year-old, so I know that 20-year-olds don't behave that way. But I think that Vivian was very determined, and I think that she had a tremendous amount of faith. Because, that, I don't think she was putting on a show when she says, when she walked in and she smiled and she said, I didn't feel that afraid. There was again, for those who knew Vivian, there was a certain sense of internal calm around her when all hell was breaking loose. And, I think it was just really by faith, the faith of my parents. Vivian was she was, again, a person of faith. And that's the only thing that you could say that would have gotten her through that. Because I think about, again, as I look at it from the standpoint of having been a college student and having children who are on their way to college, and you think of college as being a joyful experience. You can't wait. It's going to be great and a new life and a new experience. And she basically went to college not really having friends. And she told me this story, and one of the women who was in her class actually lives in Washington and told me this. She said that when Vivian got there, she said there were a lot of girls there who were from the North who didn't think this was a big deal. And they said, we knew your sister, and she was very nice, and we, spent time in the dorms. And she said, but when we were out in public, we had to not speak to her. And she said because this was the quote, she said that her sorority sisters came to her and said, you know what, this is going to really hurt us at Rush. So you could speak to her in the dorm, but when Vivian said she would walk across campus and people would walk right by her and not speak to her. And you go to the cafeteria and you do whatever and you have to sit by yourself. And I can't imagine anything more hurtful and more painful in a college experience as something that's supposed to be great. So you have to have something inside that allows you to endure that. And as we see, James Hood couldn't do it.
Yeah. And can you tell us about the students? I mean, what did it do, to the student body, having this major event happen, and they still had, 4 years of school to get through, and there was something different. Their lives had changed as well.
One thing I think that can't be emphasized enough is that Vivian's behavior, her stoic nature of going through this, inspired all of the students, because at that time, when you walked across campus, if you spoke of integration, you were worried that the Ku Klux Klan would kill you. But Vivian showed such great courage. And what has happened is that while a lot of society may not remember what happened there, at Alabama they remember, because we're going through a similar thing right now with sororities. Sororities which remained segregated until last year. And many now of the white girls have stood up in their sorority houses and insisted on rushing African American women, and they cite as an example Vivian's great courage in showing the courage themselves of standing up on that major issue on campus. And they're winning, and part of it is still Vivian's ongoing influence.